All of you are aware next year is the 25th anniversary of 9/11. And for those also know that this year was the 20th anniversary for the 7/7 attacks and the 21/7 attacks in London. And we thought it would be really appropriate to kind of have a conversation, start off a little bit about the lived experience, two different lenses, two different perspectives on the two different incidents, but also to look at the lessons learned and to look at kind of what are the evolving needs of victims, survivors, first responders, and family members over a period of time, and that evolution. And then finally, to look at the importance of remembrance and of memorials. There isn't a community that has not been impacted by large-scale tragedy. And at the end of the day, we need to be learning, it's been said many times over the day, to look at what other communities have done, how they've responded, where they didn't do so well or where they did really well, but also about the fact that this is a continuum. This is not, the tragedy's been over for a couple of weeks or a couple of months or the legal process is over. This is about looking at, if we really want healthy and safe communities, about taking care of and how we are taking care of people and pre-planning for that. So with that, I get to be the moderator. I know you won't have to see me as much tomorrow, I promise. I'll go to a different mic now. So I thought what I'd do is start off with, because I've known both of you for many years, but Mary, particularly the work that Voices has done, and we kind of said, who do we want to go first? And obviously looking at it, kind of 9/11 happened, and then 5 years later, the 7/7. So I think, Mary, if I could ask you to talk a little bit about your own personal experience and the perspectives of kind of where you were, what happened, and what was the, you know, how the community responded to that.
Well, I'll go back a bit. Before 9/11, I worked at an outpatient mental health clinic. That's where I was that day. And as part of my training, I attended a conference probably back in the late 90s. It was after the Oklahoma City bombing, and a woman, Marcia Kite, and Ann, I'm sure you know her, spoke, and she talked about, she had lost her daughter in the Oklahoma City bombing, and she showed this powerful film, but afterwards she talked about how that impacted the community. They had a higher incidence of depression, anxiety, substance abuse, job loss, so on and so forth. And as a result of her, hearing her, I became part of the response team at the clinic. I never went back to work after 9/11 at the clinic. I've gone back to work in a big way after 9/11 and starting the organization, but many of my colleagues actually responded, and some of them are still working in Newtown today. So I think that, you know, Brad called Frank that day at work and then left me a message at home. My work schedule had changed, and then Frank called me at the office. And when I was actually sitting with a client that had a diagnosis of schizophrenia, and I thought, I've made a lot of progress with him, because when I received that call, he said, I think you need to end this session. And so I walked into the adjoining building, and as I walked in, I saw the plane hit the second tower. So, so that was sort of the backdrop. And when, certainly there was such an outpouring, you know, my family and friends basically took over our house, helped me with the funeral plans. And then Chris Shays is here, our former congressman. He actually attended Brad's funeral along with all of the constituents. And he, it was through his office that I reached out to the other families in Connecticut. And that's really the support groups I held in my home for about a year, really set the foundation of starting the organization.
Thank you. And John, where were you? And when tell us a little bit about, I think there isn't a person about 9/11, but with the 7/7 and 21/7 attack, a little bit about that, where you were, what your role was, and your experiences with that.
Yeah, sure. I'm glad you said very different perspectives at the start, Sue, because I have had a very, very different experience to Mary, nothing like that kind of scale, because I came from it from a perspective as a lead investigator. At the time of 7/7, which was 7th of July 2005, I was a counter-terrorism senior investigator responsible for anything related to terrorism in the north of England, but as a day job, because things like that fortunately didn't happen regularly, mainly homicide, major incident investigations. 7/7, for those that are not familiar with it, was a series, a planned, orchestrated attack at 4 different locations, almost simultaneously in London, attacking the transport network, the Underground. 3 bombs at 8:50 on the 7th of July, killed 52 innocent people and injured nearly 800 more. An hour later, almost exactly, a bus that would been additional buses had been put on to support the people that couldn't use the Underground. Nearly 3 million people a day use the Underground to move around, and all of a sudden that, as you can imagine, was incapacitated. And then almost exactly 2 weeks to the day, within an hour of 2 weeks to the day, we had 4 more bombs go off, almost identical, 3 on the Underground and 1 on a bus. Fortunately, not through anything other than inadequacy on the part of the bombers, those bombs didn't detonate properly, and there was no loss of life on that particular day. So why did I get involved? I was living and working in the north of England, so I was 230 odd miles away from London, and my reflections of that day, Sue was sitting in my office, was in the middle of a couple of homicide cases, thinking about, what we would be doing, when all of a sudden, I guess like most people, remember exactly where I was, not only when I saw the planes hit the Twin Towers on 9/11, but on 7/7 was in my office looking up at the TV screen, watching what was then being reported as a power surge on the Underground and some underground explosions. Very quickly, though, it became apparent that these looked like coordinated terrorist attacks. And to put it in context, the United Kingdom had had a long history of experience of terrorism. We'd had the Troubles, as they're known, in Northern Ireland for 30-odd years, that had manifested itself on the mainland with detonations of improvised explosive devices. But in all of those cases, there had been very, very limited loss of life. The political desires of the IRA and the provisional movement was one of disruption to government, was one of an orchestrated or an organised cell of activity. It was structured attacks. They had a series of warnings. They used to ring us up and say, hey, we've put a big bomb in a bus or a lorry and it's going to go off at this time. And they would give enough notice for evacuations to take place. And yes, it created devastating effects to buildings and infrastructure. But on the main, very limited loss of life on the UK mainland. I mean, over 3,000 killed in Northern Ireland over that duration, and more than 300 police and military during that campaign. So we'd never experienced anything like you'd experienced, Mary, on 9/11, of a mass attack, casualty attack on citizens, particularly in the capital. So we were dealing with a very unknown kind of set of circumstances. The way I became involved, Sue, and then I'll hand back to you and Mary, was the work of the Metropolitan Police. And Alistair's not here, but he spoke this morning as a representative of the Met. I work really closely with the Met, the National Counter-Terrorism kind of capability, focused obviously a lot on London. Did an absolutely remarkable job. That if you imagine the chaos that occurs when detonations go on absolutely cram-packed metro trains that are 70 yards underground in old Victorian tunnels that are single space, there's no room, and those detonations are of such severity that they blow the bottoms out of the trains, that they rip apart the steel rails, and the impact, because it's got nowhere to go, because of the confinement of the tunnels, created multiple mass trauma, because the waves of explosion just kept rebounding and rebounding and rebounding. So, you know, people that were not necessarily caught up in the immediacy of the explosion and were, you know, essentially, you know, immediately kind of almost vaporized, many others were affected because of that continuous kind of impact. Despite all of that chaos, despite all of that confusion, within less than 48 hours from that, the, again, remarkable work of the first responders and the forensic examiners was able to identify some material from those bombs, some correspondence, bits of partial credit card, a partial gymnasium card, that made them think that they'd got some inquiries to make outside of London. And it happened to be that some of those inquiries ended up on my desk. And I was explaining this at lunchtime. It was a combination, really, of something that was said earlier today, of what I would call good local policing, local knowledge, combined with extreme expertise at the very sharp end of capability. And they were thinking that these people could be victims, the information could be about the victims. And I remember looking at the information that had come out from London saying, do we know anything about this named person? We've got a partial credit card, we've checked with the banks, it could be this person, may not be, we don't know, but it could be. Do we know anything on our intelligence systems about this person? Oh, and by the way, we found this partial card that it belongs to a gymnasium membership, and there's a partial address on that that's also in your part of the world, up in the north of England. Do we know anything about this person? And my immediate thought was, hey, these are probably a couple of people that have travelled together to London to go sightseeing and have got caught up in this. What a tragedy. That's going to be difficult to handle and deal with. And then very rapidly, and I remember this moment like it was yesterday, realised that those two bits of correspondence had come from two different bomb scenes. And I remember thinking, you know, with that kind of sinking feeling that you get, what's the chances, call me an old cynic as a detective, but what's the chances of two people who lived within a mile of each other, 250 miles away from where these events had taken place, have been unlucky enough to be in the same city in London at the same point where two different detonations in different places of London had gone off at that exact time, and therefore being involved in it. And I remember picking the phone up to one of my colleagues in London and saying, I think the bombers came from here, and these are two of them. And of course, we didn't know, and I'll come on to this in terms of lessons learned, Sue, we didn't know at that time that they were suicide bombers. We'd never had suicide bombers. The only suicide bomber that had come out of the UK at that time had been in 2003 in Mike's Place in Tel Aviv, in a cafe. We'd never had homegrown suicide bombers. And all I could remember, all I could think of, and I'll touch on this in a moment too, in a subsequent, was the year before, in 2003, there'd been a mass transit attack in Madrid, killing, similar kind of number of people, in fact more, there was nearly 200 killed. But there, the suicide bombers, again, inspired by an Al-Qaeda ideology, their methodology had been to not only detonate on these mass crowded transit systems, but they deliberately saved themselves to go back to their home addresses, leaving correspondence, knowing that the authorities and the agencies would go around to investigate and to arrest them. And it was only then that they then created secondary detonations to kill the first responders. So we had members, innocent members of the public, killed at the scenes of the transit, and then 2 days later, when the police and the intelligence agencies went round to investigate, a whole series of other fatalities when they detonated and killed themselves when the police were investigating. And that was very much in my mind of thinking, is that what's going to happen, with the people that were from my kind of neck of the woods?
And John, what you were saying sort of triggered my thoughts that, we didn't know if our loved ones were dead or alive. And so I know Brad had, I think, 6 or 7 missing person reports that his friends were going from hospital to hospital with his photograph looking for him. And that my phone was just constantly ringing. And, I think just all the uncertainty really not knowing for quite some time if people were dead or alive. And then, of course, the wait for those, our loved ones to be identified by the medical examiner. And it was November 2001. We were just leaving where they were going to be recognizing Brad at the high school where he and his brothers went to school. And they were retiring his number. And the doorbell rang, and it was this young 22-year-old policeman that told me that they had identified, some, very little of Brad's remains. And, I had to just like put myself together again to be able to go to this recognition event. And how could I possibly share that with my friends about what I was just told of? Because when you'd say, well, I was notified of his remains, they think a body. And they don't realize, it's small portions of their body that had been identified. So, so anyway, I think it was so traumatic that it was even hard to really talk about to people that you knew and loved, because you didn't want to traumatize them with what you were going through yourself. So I'm sorry, that just triggered that memory of, the spontaneous memorials, the vigils, all the things that were going on here in New York City in a big way, but also in local communities where people had lost family members.
John, can I ask you to ponder some of the lessons learned from responding to them, what you've learned since, and how it's helped shape national and global responses, and the need for the taking down of silos, and how kind of, I think you look at it as policies, organizational structures, things that change as a result of that. But also talk a little bit about, we had a chance to chat about this over the last couple of days, but to chat a little bit about in the challenges and the responding and what we know now about supporting not just the victims' families, but about the members as well that are involved in these. If you could add a little bit on that.
Sure. I think anybody that says, going back 20 years, 24 years, that we were very prepared and ready and competent to deal with the events, obviously 7/7 wasn't on the scale of 9/11, but nevertheless, there were 800 people, many of which had lost limbs or had lost sight or lost consciousness. So there was still a huge degree of confusion about where those victims, survivors, deceased had been taken. And, given that London is a huge multicultural city, many different nationalities involved. So it wasn't just people from the UK getting in touch, it was people from all over wanting to know what was happening, and actually completely, I think, not completely, but ill-prepared to be able to answer those questions as timely as I think we would like to think that we could do today. There was definitely still challenges then on the different makeup of UK policing. I have to say, and I'm only saying this because I'm from the UK, I think we were infinitely blessed with having a smaller number of agencies involved than happens in the US, with the thousands of different federal, state and local entities that exist that all have, fingers in the melting pot. In the UK, we have essentially 43 geographic police entities that deal with everything from beginning to end, and then one national domestic intelligence agency, MI5, as it's affectionately known. But even then, with those still breakdown, there was differences in training, differences in capability, differences in structure. So when I've reflected, and we've, on our 20th anniversary in the UK, I don't know whether it's a thing, whether it's because it's the 25th or the 20th, but in the UK, the media made a big deal of this being an anniversary. Perhaps we just do decade anniversaries rather than half decades, because on the 10th anniversary it was a big deal. On the 20th anniversary it's been a huge thing. There's been multiple documentaries, TV documentaries, even Netflix, So some international documentaries that have brought some of this back, and a lot of memorial kind of events that I've spoken to. And I broke it down into sort of 4 or 5 areas, really. Those were the preparedness, and how much of this we were learning on the job to deal with such huge scale events and tragedy. The structural changes and the breakdowns of the silo and the compatibility of those various intelligence structures and policing entities to work together in a way that was coherent. Some of the technologies that are available now that weren't available then is a big influencer in how we would have dealt with things differently. Obviously incredibly relevant to what we're talking about here, and the organisation that Mary leads and that you lead is, completely hand up here as an investigator leading the, who did this and why. Were victims at the very centre of my thinking back then? Not at all. My job was to find out who'd done it, why had they done it, who else might be responsible, where did it take me all the way back to Quetta in the Pakistan-Afghan border, who was responsible for the training camps to drill that ideology in. So yes, some of that was relevant in terms of answering the questions to the victims, but were they at the centre of my thinking in 2005? Quite honestly, no, they weren't. But obviously now, through people like you, I've had a huge change in influence. And then lastly, so thank you. No. And then lastly, I think, things that have brought it home to me, particularly in viewing some of the documentaries. Obviously, I've kept in touch with many of the first responders, with many of the victims that I've met over the years. But actually, just to see how traumatized and affected some of those first responders are still, who've had probably very little in terms of psychological support, PTSD support, who had real difficulty in articulating, their responses. I relayed a story last night, something I didn't actually know until quite recently, and that on many of the trains they were incredibly hot, over 100 degrees underneath in the tunnels. They were full of rats. It was incredibly hot, it was very dangerous, there was lots of asbestos dust, there was lots of mangled metal, there's incredibly high electrification that obviously needed to be turned off, but there was a requirement as quickly as possible by the authorities to get London moving around. Everything grinds to a halt if suddenly you don't move 3 million people by the underground. And the first responders that were down there recovering the survivors, people, as I said, without legs, without arms, who were deaf, who had gone blind, who were badly burned and mutilated. And once that had been done, I remember almost on the first day being told about, as I said, I didn't learn about this till much later, that a couple of the first responders were said, right, now we can lock this tunnel down now, we can secure it, everybody needs to come out, the temperatures were unbearable, you needed a rest, you needed to come out. And 2 responders, I remember saying, I wasn't leaving the dead bodies to be on their own in the tunnels overnight. And they slept on those mangled trains amongst the blood and the body parts and the deceased, because they felt so personally responsible that they couldn't leave them behind. I thought that was an incredibly active, selfless leadership on their part. That, as I said, they didn't shout about that. We've only learned about that quite recently. So it's amazing how this affects so many different people in different ways. And certainly now we have, as you mentioned earlier this morning, very strong wellbeing programs about first responders and people that are involved, that we'd like to think that we're much better prepared to deal in all of those areas I've talked about. But we certainly weren't ready then.
Mary, can you talk a little bit about some of the lessons learned from your perspective and how things changed over, I know you have a slide, because I think it's a powerful way to look at this, which is where
Well, we don't have to do the
You don't want to do that?
slide. No.
Okay, but it's a good one.
Okay, it is a good one.
It's a nice, it really kind of shows the evolution. But could you talk a little bit about the lessons learned from your perspective, what those challenges were, kind of what the needs were met, weren't met, and how we need to think about this in terms of a continuum?
Well, I think when you think about 9/11, people focus on New York City, but there were actually 3 sites, and they were, of all the 3 sites, when you think about Shanksville being an open field in the middle of nowhere, New York You know, it was highest real estate where the attacks occurred, and it was the largest crime scene in the history of our country. And then you had the Pentagon, who had an infrastructure in place working with military families. So even the notification process was in place. When you think back to 9/11, most people didn't use email. We didn't have the web. There was no Google. So the problem was really getting information, and that's why we started coming into New York and going to the Family Assistance Center, and it was like a printing press there. They'd have, you know, another donation or another service that was available, and they would actually print all of this information out and give it to you. For the most part, the families in Connecticut, you know, the women lost their husbands. The last place they were going to go when they have small children was to go into New York City, you know, after their husband had just died there. So I think, you know, there wasn't the infrastructure. There was problems with communicating. We didn't have MOUs in place. Agencies didn't share information. And all of that was sort of the backdrop of not meeting the needs of the people that were affected. And then, of course, the challenge in 93 countries being impacted. So think about the medical examiner making, number one, getting the DNA sample to do the match, but then on top of that, contacting the family. How do you make a notification? Even in Connecticut, as I said, this young police officer who had absolutely no training on making a notification, you know, I was consoling him when he was telling me. So, which is not how it should be. So I think that, you know, victim services were in their infancy, and the agencies were not sharing information. There was pushback from the administration about having any kind of investigation. They said it would be duplicating efforts. And so I think, you know, I think all of that sort of laid the groundwork for these families coming forward and these coalitions being built, you know, to work with the memorial, the LMDC, to make sure the memorial had the components that we wanted. For us to create the living memorial during the time that the memorial was being built, I mean, what a contribution we made to that museum if they were starting 10 years later trying to meet with these families. And it gave the families an opportunity to commemorate because they were stuck. They had no one to talk to about their loved ones, or no one to share about the, you know, the history of their life. And then I think the Victims' Compensation Fund was a very complicated issue, and the people didn't trust the federal government. So we had to educate them about that process. And then, of course, the responders and survivors who, like us fighting for the commission, had to fight to get a process in place to receive medical and psychological support. And they're still, unfortunately, still fighting for funding for that program, which is appalling to me. So I think that it was a long time ago. It was 25 years ago. I think a lot has changed. You know, I see my friends in the back there that have made significant changes in the delivery of support for families. But have we accomplished it all? No. You know, we still have a long way to go before there's recognition or services provided over the long term. And, you know, I feel very strongly that people do better. They're able to recover faster if they have the support they need. But if they don't have the support, they have to fight for the resources. They have to fight for the services. And then, and they have to navigate not just one issue, but hundreds of issues and hundreds or thousands of organizations, just trying to sort out who these people are and what kinds of services that they provide. So I think the coordination has improved, but I still think we have a ways to go.
From the investigation and the legal processes, it's kind of two different entities going on here, if I can say that. And Mary, I know tomorrow there's going to be a great presentation on the Guantanamo Bay hearings and the commission and what's going on there. Can you talk a little bit about where you were then, but where you are now in terms of supporting victims, witnesses, survivors, and families, ahead of, we all know there's a big difference from what time of attack and the length of time between any legal process, be it an inquest, an inquiry, be it a criminal process. There is a significant, and how do you, compared to what happened then, where are we now in terms of how are we meeting those needs so there is that continuity and support throughout the legal investigative processes?
Yeah, I mean, as anybody in law enforcement knows, there's often dual track of investigation and due process to try and identify others that might have been involved. I think a key difference with the events here in New York were that we had got 4 homegrown individuals that were born in the United Kingdom, had been to school in the United Kingdom, that worked in the United Kingdom. And if you'd have asked anybody the day before, were they going to be notorious as the 4 London bombers? One was a primary school teacher, one had just been selected to play a sport for his representative sport because he was very good. The other one had just taken his kind of teenage exams and been successful in that. These were not unachievers. They didn't have the kind of grievances that we've talked about before. They were pretty much, getting along with it. So we had some of the challenges of one particular community that doesn't get talked about much, and I suspect there's a reason for that, because we always focus directly on the people who've been directly affected by loss of life or injury or survivors. But actually, we've got a community near to where I live that is still not healed, because everybody in that community, apart from those 4 individuals, were innocent as well. And yet to this day, that community of, a suburb of outskirts of Leeds in the north of England is tarnished as the town that produced the 4 bombers. And the media, even now, and particularly on anniversaries, still are knocking on doors, are interviewing people, and they just say, look, we just want to we didn't choose for these people to be living amongst us and to do what they did. So that's one aspect. The other is, I just want to touch on is, and I know we're going to hopefully get to this later on, Sue, is around leadership. But apologies here for the attorneys or the lawyers in the room, and I know we've definitely got one. But you get a lot of advice from a law enforcement perspective when you're dealing with these inquiries. So we had government inquiries. I went to Parliament to do 2 parliamentary inquiries, our Intelligence and Security Committee. There's obviously a lot of very sensitive intelligence and information. We were dealing with people that had been inspired by international means, who travelled out to Afghanistan and Pakistan border to be trained, in inverted commas, to be inspired to come back and to do this. So there was lots of moving parts with lots of people. And I have to say, from a legal perspective, when I was preparing myself to give evidence at all of those inquiries, and the big inquiry was the public inquiry, which was also the coronial inquiry, it was combined into one, didn't take place till 5 years after the event. So lots of those emotions that people who've been directly affected, both the families, the survivors, the injured, and also some people from those communities wanted answers. They wanted, they'd got questions. They'd gone through that angry phase. They were now, really wanted to understand why. Lots of the advice we were given from a legal perspective was all about reputational management, protecting the state and the organisations. Nobody can be seen to be lame for this. You mentioned last night about how government really didn't want this because they didn't want fingers being pointing at, who might have missed something, who might have done this. And throughout all of that, I took a stance in all the evidence that I gave that the only way to deal with this was to, do what I'd done for 20 odd years before these events, which was to rely on the facts and the evidence and state it as it was, however painful or difficult that might be. And I have to say, the number of people subsequently, particularly those that have been directly affected, who I think were grateful for that honesty and grateful for that kind of exposure. Obviously, there are still some things that nobody talks about because of the national security implications of it. But in terms of, you know, that nothing was hidden, we were very transparent. My insistence that we were transparent and disclosed all of everything that we could about what we knew about the individuals beforehand, what had happened beforehand, before the events, I think was a very important kind of leadership, a leadership lesson for me, certainly.
Mary, I know you could probably talk for a long time about the challenges, but we could touch on a few of them, and then we'll head into the importance of memorialization.
Ooh, where do I start?
I know.
Well, I think I talked about the challenge of getting information. I think one thing when you have a group of victims, well, I call them victims' family members. I always think of my son as the victim because he was the one that was killed. But I think that people have different opinions. So no matter what the topic is, you know, and I'll bring up Guantanamo as a good example, that it's very far away. We have a presentation tomorrow. I see Deborah in the audience here and Jack Ryan, who are going to be talking tomorrow. But it's a long way away. You know, there's so much legalese over the years. There's a stop and start, you know, and here we are 24 years later, and, you know, there hasn't been a trial. So, you know, some people wanted the plea bargain, some people want the death penalty, some people want life imprisonment, different opinions. So I think that, you know, as an organization even, we try to stay neutral on what the solution is, but make sure that people have the information that they need. And I think that's why it's been so critical for us to remain connected with the medical examiner. There were just 4 identifications in the last few months, and we work with the medical examiner, work with the family. When the press contacts us, you know, we contact the family, get their permission. You know, they may want photographs from our living memorial. We never give them permission without contacting the family. So I think I think staying in touch with those organizations now that, so to speak, the dust has been settled, the memorial is built, and, you know, some of the issues like the compensation is done. But Jason, maybe you could put up that one slide just to demonstrate. So when you look at the timeline, when you think about all of the issues that victims are impacted by, the World Trade Center Health Program, you know, you can see that didn't start till 2010. We were meeting with responders and survivors that had cancer and PTSD like the first year. I mean, that's 9 years later, and they're still fighting for funding. The compensation for our families closed in 2003. That was a really traumatic process to go through, you know, to justify the life of your loved one, and, you know, and a monetary settlement. You know, it just was like blood money, I'd say. The compensation started with the responders and survivors, so if they have a certified condition, there's a compensation for that, but not if they have a mental health condition. The commission, you know, it was 2002, and, you know, it was legislated, and thanks to Chris Shays in the back, my former congressman who was so instrumental, legislated and funded. And that's made significant changes. But like I said, the memorial is in the middle of New York City, some of the highest real estate. So that didn't open, you know, for over a decade. And then the museum 4 years later. The Guantanamo trial is still going on. You know, I don't know if that will ever come to resolution. And I give the people credit that are making that trip, you know, to Guantanamo to follow that suit. The notification of remains, I think they still have over 7,000 human remains, and there's still 1,100 families that have never been notified of remains. Some of the people that were just notified were notified for the first time. So think about that. 24 years later, getting that call. The one woman was driving in her car up the expressway when she got the call. And then the personal effects, I don't know what ever happened to them. The property clerk used to come to our, our event here, but then that went poof. So where are those thousands and thousands of items that people may want to have, those personal items of their loved ones? So you can see why, we're approaching the 25th anniversary, and it's still challenging for these families. A lot of family members have died already. So it's the next generation that's coming up that hasn't followed any of this. They may not even know if their loved ones' remains were identified, and now they could potentially get a call from the medical examiner. So that's why it's so important for us to continue on, and then of course with the responders and survivors, there's 8,500 that have died and 140,000 in treatment or in the World Trade Center Health Program, but 90,000 that are in treatment. Is that overwhelming enough?
Yeah, it is overwhelming enough. I want to finish up talking about the importance of remembrance and memorial in terms of resilience and in terms of healing.
So maybe put the memorial back up instead of this very depressing slide.
We're going to finish on a where were we, where are we now, and where do we need to be going? Because at the end of the day, I'm going to make a comment because I've been very privileged for many years to listen to all of you that have had the courage to share and look at that. And I always in my head think of the continuum, because this whole day we've talked about the importance of prevention. We've talked about the importance of early intervention. We've talked about, sadly, how we're prepared for and to respond to when tragedy strikes. And then we've talked about how that needs to be victims, families, survivors, all those impacted need to be supported as it heads into any legal process. Could be still ongoing, could be 5 years from now. We have been very fortunate to listen to, and I know Ann, you're in the back there, Ann Seymour, and she did a big report with the United States Department looking at how to support people through very complex trials or such as terrorism. I can tell you that France Victim has done a fantastic job with things like the INVICTM that they put in place when they had to support thousands of witnesses and people that are involved in their civil process from acts of terrorism. And then how other countries have learned from that. And that's what we do with INVICTM, is we listen and learn from everybody, take them back to our countries, because every legal process could be different, but looking at how that you provide that continuous support. But one of the things I've also had the privilege of learning to is some of the challenges, but also some of the lessons learned from and I know there was extensive work that Mary and the people put into for the memorial here at 9/11. Mm-hmm. We've had any of you that know Gel from Norway looking at some of the challenges that come there, but there's a common theme here, which is that it needs to be, and as Mary said, every victim will come from their own lived experience, will come with their own, what they feel is the priorities and the rest of that. But when you bring the right people together and have their voices at the table, you hopefully can come to and avoid some of the pitfalls that other people have learned from, is something as important as both at the time there's the immediate and spontaneous memorials, there's the longer term ones, and then the ones that, like we're looking at. I think Las Vegas is more long-term memorials due to open in a year or 2 years. So these do take time because we do need to get it right. But it is also an important part of healing and resilience, and I wonder if you could say a few words about that, Mary.
Well, I think the memorial, the important thing when you're creating a memorial is to have the families involved. And like I said, there's going to be a lot of opinions, and I give Joe Daniels and Alice Greenwald, all the credit in the world for being able to navigate. They set up, I think there were 9 stakeholder groups, the families being one of them. So we were able to, in those meetings, and there was constant turnover, so we repeated it and repeated it and repeated it. But we wanted water to drown out the sound of the city. We wanted to be able to touch the names. We wanted the names to be around the tower where they died. And then, of course, they had to incorporate the Shanksville and the Pentagon in those names. We wanted the ramp to go down. That was really symbolic of us going down on those anniversaries to bedrock. We wanted the footprints of the building to be preserved, and we wanted the last beam that came out of the site to be prominent in the memorial. We wanted the slurry wall to be exposed, and the slurry wall, if you've been to the museum, is right where the last beam is. And that tells a story because if that had cracked, all of Lower Manhattan would have been underwater. So that was really, a subtle story that was told. We wanted the faces of the people that had died, and the memorial wanted 1 to 3 photographs at the time, and I just didn't feel that would tell the story of their life. And so we put, much to the chagrin of our staff, we didn't have any limitations on the number of photographs. And our staff would sit down with families and they'd bring, boxes of photographs and quilts and mementos that we photographed. We wanted, or I was of the opinion that I wanted the remains, the repository that the medical examiner has at the museum. I felt it should be between the 2 towers because our families have been pulled in this direction and that direction. So if it was in one tower versus the other, to me, it signified bringing the families together. And then, of course, that beautiful blue wall, and they have every color of blue is a different color to signify the blue sky that day. And then the survivor staircase, that was a big fight to make sure that was preserved. And that, again, told the story of the people that were able to evacuate. So I think the memorial, to me, is, a place of solace, and I think walking through it, it's almost, home in a way, because we spent so many years in all of those meetings trying to make sure that what we wanted in the memorial was incorporated.
John, I know recently for the 20th anniversary of 7/7, you were involved and there was a lot of different things that took place, but for those of you who don't know, that Netflix series, I watched all 4. It was very powerful. I found the first one extremely powerful because there's a lot of the real footage. But John was in the second Netflix series talking about from the investigative lens. And then John Boucher, another one of our colleagues from Link, was in the third one. But I would encourage you, if you have a chance, to watch those. And John spoke earlier, I think this morning, about the BBC documentary, which he felt was better. But this is about how do we get people to remember that you need to have in place, and that the impact can be very long-term, can be a lifelong journey for the families, for that, but also for your own members. But John, can I just a little bit more about the impact of the had on that remembrance and the importance of that?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, the image that you can see to the right of the 9/11 memorial is the 52 sort of stacks to represent the individuals in London. I didn't have any direct involvement in that. One thing I did have involvement with, and slightly, again, different just because of the circumstances, was that we also had 4 remains of 4 suicide bombers. And we made, even back then, were at pains to make sure that they were never mentioned in the same light as the 52 victims. So we never said there were 56 people killed. We said 52 people were killed. 4 other people took that choice. The second was to make sure there was a real clear distinction between the remains of those individuals Secondly, after a lot of discussion because of legal and other reasons about making sure that they didn't appear as martyrs' graves anywhere. We didn't want anybody to be able to go to as a shrine, but we also didn't want it to become a place that others would desecrate, from perhaps an extreme right-wing perspective either. We just didn't want it to be drawn attention to. So they're all anonymous. Nobody knows. I know where they are, but not very few people. And the coroner, but hardly anybody else does. And that was a very deliberate and conscious act. And interestingly, when we got to 2017 and we had the Manchester Arena bomb and they found the remains of Alberde, it was interesting that our corporate memory was, I got a phone call sort of, 7 years after retiring, so to speak, to say, what did we do with the bodies of the suicide bomber? Because we don't really know. And, it was interesting to replay that back. But I had some soul searching to do when I was approached about making these TV documentaries and endless news appearances and podcasts and things about whether, was I doing more harm than good by volunteering to be involved in it? I felt that they were all done very responsibly. The Netflix one, I don't think the BBC one was just more factual. Netflix inevitably was a slightly more storytelling, a narrative around the circumstances, rather than just a factual sort of documentary. But one of the reasons why I chose to do it, I'd spoken to a number of the victims on the couch in front of, national television, live national television, about what their perspective was. And, the rationale for me to be involved was nothing to do with self kind of glorification. It was all to do with, although 20 years doesn't feel like a long time, there's a whole generation of Londoners that don't remember the events. My two youngest, I've got four kids, my two youngest kids are now in their early 30s. And so they were only, pre-teenage when that happened, and they don't really have any clue about what it was about. And, not only do the public forget in many cases, but governments forget. And the more success that the Rebecca and Megan and the UK and others have in preventing terrorist attacks, the more authorities, funding goes off the boil in saying, well, do you really need all of that money and all of them resources to deal with this because nothing's really happening too much, and it's a conscious effort, I think, to make sure that we don't forget. So there was a positive story of memorial. It was an opportunity for those victims that wanted to be involved to be recognised and be involved, and I think they were grateful for it. And I think I come back to the point I made earlier. I think they were grateful for I tried to be as honest and as transparent as possible in the narrative that I gave. And it actually, some people said to me, that's the first time I've actually heard that part of the story, and I'm so glad that you told it. So I think, in a small, tiny way, it was beneficial. But I do want to touch on, if we've got time, Sue, a little bit about the kind of leadership that you and Mary and others have taken and how that has influenced and inspired me. So one of the outcomes of the 9/11 Commission was a conversation in at the highest levels in the authorities in the United States about how could we break down some of these kind of silo departments, intelligence sharing, and how could that change. And somebody who's been a very close friend to all three of us, who sadly passed away only at the end of last week, was the head of the training department at Quantico in the FBI, a gentleman by the name of Mike Ferrance. Many of you may know him. But he came up with some colleagues of his and said, hey, one of the ways that we can try and address this is to try and create a network of senior leaders in CT as a kind of a thought piece to get people together to think about how we break some of those down. And, without going into a long history, that's how the Leadership in Counterterrorism program was born, with the first iteration in 2004. So within a year of the publication of that, he and colleagues in the US had mobilized the UK, had mobilized the US to do a joint entity, and a year later had also mobilised the Australians and the Canadians to join force in what became the International Five Eyes Leadership in Counter-Terrorism Programme that has endured to this day. And, from that moment on, we've now had over 800 people that have been through that graduate programme. In 2007, Sue and I, as founders of the LINC program with Mike, founded the Alumni Association because we were all getting old and crinkly and retiring. That's me, not Sue, obviously. And we felt that we still had things to give. But the thing that I say is that it's real, it's an example, I think, by so many people of a selfless leadership because, you know, there's, as I say, I don't have the personal experiences that Mary has or the personal reflections, but it still feels to me like it's such an important thing to do, to stay involved and offer whatever contribution I can make to it. And that's why I'm so proud and privileged to be the head of the LinCT Alumni Association and work really closely with Sue and our annual president that changes, Rebecca this year, who's such a strong supporter. And all the agencies and the events that we put together and the partnership that we founded with INVICTM and with Voices, and we're so privileged to be invited here to support you, Mary, I think is all part of that kind of leadership that it's all of our responsibility to maintain the kind of emphasis that this is so important and should never be forgotten. And we should continue to contribute on it. And that's, for me, was one of the reasons why remembrance was so important, and long may that continue.
Thank you. Mary, we have a few minutes left. Some of the key messages that you want to leave people with in terms of going forward?
Well, I think one of the key messages would be, there's actually a sketch out there that an artist did when I was actually leaving one of the very early conferences that they had at the Javits Center. And he asked if he could sketch me, and I was carrying quilts out from the event. Had to be like, I don't know, maybe October or November of 2001. And we found this journal that Brad wrote after he died. And on the first page, it said, "You can tell the character of a man by what he does for the man who can offer him nothing." And I look over the last 24 years, and I think I've been so fortunate to meet so many people that have stepped forward and helped in any way, you know, over the course of the years, and the wonderful relationships that we've created, the people like Sue and John and so many of you in the audience that, you know, want to do the right thing, want to move the ball forward, and want to help, and our change agents, yourself and your work. So that's been really a true gift. And I was just speaking at a memorial in Connecticut, and it was so interesting because some of the people there were in that first support group that we held in our living room. And she said, you know, I came to a couple of them, but I couldn't because I had small children, and here they are. And so she introduced me to her now grown children, and they've since sent me an email, you know, because they're doing this, that, or the other thing. I met a son of another family that I know that, you know, really struggled with the loss of their son, and he now is getting involved. And I remembered the story of his family and what they did in memory of their son, and when we worked with them on the living memorial, you know, which was, you know, I don't know, 20 or 15 years ago. But he was so thrilled that I remembered that. And yet this was the first time he'd ever come to a memorial. And we're hearing from, and Kara and Stephanie and the staff can back me up on this, we're hearing from people, you know, in the last 2 months, you know, people that we've never heard from before that are reaching out and asking for help. A lot of those people have never talked about their experience on 9/11. They've never talked about their loss. They've never talked about what they saw. They've never talked about where they were. And, you know, the groups that we have give them that opportunity to do that. So I think those are all gifts. And so that's what I'd like to share.
Can I just say one last word, Sue, and that is that, you know, on reflection and having been to this event previously and heard Mary and colleagues' stories so many times previously, you know, the work that I and my colleagues in law enforcement and intelligence community is, you know, pales into insignificance and is relatively easy by compared to the contributions that all of you in this room do to try and keep these, keep us on our toes and making sure that the people are doing the right thing. And so I think a big shout out for the people in this room who keep this alive and the memory. So thank you.
Or just, we're at the end of our time, 1 minute left, we're at the end of our time, but I started and I had the privilege of making some opening comments, as Mary did, and as well as Rebecca on behalf of Link alumni. And I said it was no surprise to see that the three agencies, and I can include other, you know, Victim Support Europe, the National Mass Violence Center, all of the different organizations. But at the end of the day, it really is understanding that it's not just about governments, it is ensuring that the voice of victims, I use, as we talked about, the broad spectrum of that, but also that civil society is involved in the response, not just in a consultation process, but as it evolves through the entire continuum. That's how we will get it right, when we include the voice of victims, survivors, families, first responders into the pre-planning, sadly when the tragedy happens and after. We've always, Rich is leaving, but I was going to say a nice comment about Rich just before he left, but he's leaving. I won't say it now. I met Rich many, many years ago, and he touched me when he spoke about the emotional response he had to some of his colleagues that died in 9/11 from the media. And what you've seen, the evolution, as Mary's talked about, is the understanding that we are in this together, and the answers lie when we work with each other. And so we do talk about a global tapestry. You need to ask yourself, for the people that are watching virtually as well, in your own community, if you ask yourself the question, are you ready to respond? I go back to, yes, you have all kinds of processes in place, but have you considered all the unique things that have to be considered when you have a mass victimization event? And that is different. And there are people from around the globe that we learn from, are here to help you, that are happy when you reach out to them, to ask them for voices. I think I've given your tip sheets right around the world. But there is so many resources able to help you and people that want to get involved. Reach out and ask, because the help is there for you, for your communities. Be you in the policing world, be you from a service provider, psychosocial. Tomorrow we're going to hear about CanEmerge, there's a little Canadian moment there, about the psychosocial response to disasters. There is a tremendous amount of learning that has taken place, lessons learned, and we need to be incorporating those. It is not something that it's one of we've got it done. It's an evolution and will continue to evolve as we learn from each other. I know it's the end of the day, everybody's tired, but I just want to say the same as John and Mary. I just want to echo what a privilege it is to work with the people we get to work with, to learn from, but also to take action. And that's what we hear. I said it earlier this morning. People who have lost loved ones or who have suffered themselves need to know that their loss and their suffering will result in change. And that's what we're doing here today, resulting in change. And I want to thank all the speakers and people who are here. And I'm going to turn it, is Frank here, or are you closing?
Just real quick, I'd like to thank our sponsors.
Yes.
I'd like to thank our sponsors, Turk and Heath, Kreinler, Peregrine, Motley Rice, 9/11 Day. I hope that if you haven't made a backpack, that you're at least picking a backpack up in the other room. Rutgers. Jason? Next. Niche, of course, our partners, Linked Alumni Association, National Debt Relief, Hexagon, Barish McGarry, Spicer, Krause, Celebrite, ASIS, National Mass Violence Center, all in the back there, eBodyguard, Sadian Technologies, McCann Protective Services, and Zen City. Without you all, we don't receive government funding. Our events and the programs that we do throughout the year are really through donations, sponsorships of our events, and then grants. So, we really appreciate so much those that have stepped forward to sponsor. And I think Sue did a great job in closing remarks, yeah? I just want to mention, if you're here tomorrow, or if you're not here tomorrow, you can tune in via the live stream broadcast, but we're going to host, this will be our 24th annual symposium for the 9/11 community. And all of those issues that were up on that slide, we're going to be talking about. So the attorneys will be here to talk about the Saudi suit. They'll be here to talk about the World Trade Center Health Program. You know, we have a couple of great panels that we're going to be discussing, mental health response, and so on and so forth. But you're welcome to attend or tune in online, and thanks again for being here today. And keep up the great work, because, you know, it's incumbent on all of us to participate in some way. So thank you.